Alright, what we are talking about today is what we went over in class on Thursday, which is the pendulum test. So, just like last time, I'm going to start by making my sphere. I'm going to tap W to move it up. Ooh, it looks like I am in soft selection mode on sub-object mode. So, get into object mode and let's stick it up at 20. It's too high to see, so I'll zoom out and make a cylinder. After I've made the cylinder, actually the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to parent it, just so I can kind of get it reasonably close to where I want it to be. Let's say -2.5, and that way when I increase its height, and this is a problem that some people were kind of running into in class, is that when you would increase its height, when you would change the dimensions of the object, some of you were doing it with, scale tools, and because we're dealing with hierarchies and because objects inherit the sort of non-uniform scale of its parent, we don't want to change these to a non-uniform number. So I'm just going to stay away from them. I'll leave them at 1. But I'll take the height and the radius and I'll make changes to that. And I mean, I'm being more finicky about this than is strictly necessary. But now that I've got it all set, and now that I've got no scales in any of my objects, I'm just going to go ahead and Control D to duplicate them. Right, so there's 2 of them in the same spot. Make sure they're not overlapping anymore just by sliding them. And then select one, select what I want to be its parent, and parent it up. And then move it into position. I'm going to say -2.5 again. And then same thing, grab one, duplicate it, slide it down, parent it, reposition it, -2.5. And last thing, make our last sphere. I'm going to duplicate this. Now because it has a parent, it duplicated both of them. See, it's got both. And so that's fine. Just delete one of those objects and you'll be set. So make sure to grab one, grab its intended parent, parent it up, -2.5. Right now we have this uniform pendulum. And I will slide it down a little bit to 17.5. because I want it still above the ground plane in the world. I don't need it super duper high above the ground plane. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to start animating it. So I make sure auto key is on. I'm going to go over here. I'm going to tap S to set a key on my first controller object. And something that I told you guys to do in class but I didn't actually do is rename your objects. Here's the name of my object right here. The other place you can rename things is in your outliner. So, oops. So you can double click it. So, Control Master. Here's my second control object. Control 1. Oops, I was holding Shift. And my last controller here, Control 2. I mean, the names aren't super important. Just so that you've got some of your controllers, easy to grab in your outliner. Everything that starts with CTRL as a controller, it's something that you can grab and kind of move on without having to go like, is it the polycylinder or the sphere? They all start with P, right? CTRL or control, whatever sort of prefix you want to use to make sure that you can quickly identify your controllers is fine. I just use the same as the control key on the keyboard, CTRL. So use whatever you want. Use control if you want to use control. So anyway, I've got auto key on. I've set my first key. I'm going to slide this guy back to -90, and we're going to set 48 frames as my as the range of my animation, and then I'm going to I need to make sure that I set, because it's going to loop again, I need to make sure that I set the last key the same as the first key. So anyway, now I'm going to rotate it all the way over, back to 90, and you don't have to rotate it to 90 to 90. That's that's just a nice, good round number. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of make more organic changes to this. The number should be the same, though, on either side, because it's not going to swing slightly higher on one side than it is on the other. So, and actually, because of that, I'm just going to get it back to 90. Anyway, so now I've got keys on both ends. It's got a down position, and the down position has no key on it, which we're going to deal with in just a minute. But my middle key should be 0. That's probably why that wasn't animating all that well. So, Control V to play. Oh, you know what? It's swinging. Here's why. My middle key needs to be positive 90. It needs to go all the way to both sides. And I'm in a text box again. So, now it's swinging all the way back and forth. Not terribly organic movement. It's not a very good rotation. So let's get into our graph editor. I keep calling it the curve editor. Curve editor is what it's called in 3ds Max. I honestly call it either one. It doesn't matter what it's called. But technically it is the graph editor in Maya. So again, I'm going to go to my breakdown key. This is my middle key. This should be the down position. And because the down position right now is not actually at 0, I'm going to set a key, and I'm going to make sure it's at 0. And then, as we know, make the curves pretty. Get over to our down position. And now this down position actually is set just right. And I'll bet you that the reason for that is this should actually be 0 to 48 as opposed to 1 to 48, but it actually isn't a huge deal, so I'm not gonna really fix that. Anyway, I still do need to make those curves pretty though, and now let's get back into here and let's see if we've got a more natural swing, which we do. Looks pretty good. It accelerates downward and decelerates upwards. You can see that the acceleration and deceleration makes sense. So it's accelerating up, right? The steeper the curve, the faster the movement, so that's going to be acceleration as the curve becomes steeper, and I'll maybe make it just a tiny bit steeper on either end. And then it's moving slowly because it's a flatter curve here. And then again, it's accelerating, a steep sort of fall off at that point, and then comes back to sort of a neutral, maybe come back off a little bit of that. And again, kind of just play it, test to see if it's working. Works pretty well. But now we have to make sure that it has a more organic movement. So the first thing I'll do is set a key on frame 1. And on frame 24, I'm actually going to go past it. Actually, let's go past here, because I want this to kind of break. And let's say it's going to break at 4 frames. So let's bend it back a little bit. We'll call it -10, just so I can reproduce it easily later. So it's bending. And then 4 past 1. So I'm going to go 4 past 24, which is the middle position. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And now I'm going to set this to 10. And again, I'm going to set a key. And the reason I'm setting a key is because just in general on most of my keyframes, I want to have all of my channels with a keyframe on them. Right now it's actually not a huge deal, but later it will be, so I'm just kind of trying to get everybody into good habits in that way. So again, middle mouse to duplicate my first key on my last frame so that we know that it loops. And let's play it and see if it's looking alright. And it's looking alright, but I need frame, let's see. So the problem is when it gets to here, it's just returning to straight, which is correct, but I want it to return to straight at sort of a different rate. So at frame 24, let's go into my rotate Z. So this is too, this is not a good curve right here, right? Because it's trying to, let me frame it. It's trying to come straight in, right? That's the direction of this Bezier handle. It's coming straight in from frame 0. And that's wrong because it's actually coming down from the previous frame, which I want to arc down on either side. So that actually will not have fixed it more than likely, but let's play and see what it looks like. So now it's kind of snapping, and the reason it's snapping is because the rate of descent is different in here than it is here, right? So if I zoom into my whole curve, you can see that this angle and this angle are not the same, and they have to be the same, or else the animation doesn't work. So what I'm going to do is, the thing that I know about this is it should be at about 0 on frame 24. So I'm going to adjust this in both its value and its timing until this line crosses the zero line on frame 24. And then I'm going to adjust things. Now that value is 1.55. Let's just change it to 1.5, and then we'll do the same here. Negative 1.5. Adjust the curve. And then we've got... Well, now it's working, but it's far too shallow for it to be a particularly good animation. So I want to make it steeper again. And the way that we're going to fix this is we're going to allow the zero frame, the beginning and end frame, the looping frame, to not be at 1, because that's the only way that this is going to work out. So I've got kind of overlapping keys. Oh, because I only moved one of these keys. So let's grab this, grab all of the keys, and put them all on the same frame. So I'm actually going to stick this back on frame. We'll leave it on 30. No, I've changed my mind again. Changed my mind again. We're going to bring it back 2 frames. Bring it back 2 frames, and that's already in the right place. So now, in order to get this to loop smoothly, we have to allow it to be in the up position, right? Because at this position, it's still not at 0, which means our loop key on the opposite side is going to be negative 6.725. So I'm just going to undo that. Come over here, and then make this negative 6.25, and then point the keys in the right direction so that they look right, and then come back over here, set him to the same thing. Again, we're going to just middle mouse drag over to reset it. And this is going to be wrong because there's only one arc in this key, but let's watch how it's wrong real quick. So remember, it needs to be at this position, it needs to be arcing back still. What I was kind of trying to do was let the... delete that key. Oops. I was kind of trying to let the curve solve some of these problems for me by overthinking it, and I think it's going to be just better to use keyframes here. I didn't use keyframes last time, but last time I think I must have just been doing it a little bit more intelligently, and I'm not sure what the difference was. So negative 4, and again I've got to invert the number to make sure that it's sliding in the right direction, and let's play it. So that looks about right. We just need to kind of smooth out the beginning and end. Right, that's wrong. So remember, your incoming tangents should be more or less the same as your outgoing tangents on your loop frame. So that's probably about right. And so that should take that sudden speed change out at that loop moment. And that looks about right. That looks pretty good. And now we're going to do more or less the same thing to the next key. Or so the next controller, rather. So again, I'm going to set key on frame 1. And bend it back even a little bit more. Actually, I don't want it to bend back more. And in fact, I want this whole animation to be offset a little bit, because I actually still do want that 0 to be on frame 1. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come here. Looks like frame 23 is my center here. So I'm going to set a key there. And what I'm doing now is I'm essentially going to reorder my keys to get the curve in the way that I want it to be. And actually I need to remember to grab all of the keys on this object, so I'm going to do it by grabbing every single curve. I'm going to slide it up 1, and then I can just go back to my rotate Z and figure out which keys are unnecessary. It looks like I didn't actually grab all the keys. I think it's the visibility track that's still... There we go. Visibility track is super unimportant. In fact, we could delete it, it won't matter. But for right now, it's good to keep the keys on the same frame so that it doesn't sort of interfere with the visual look of your timeline. Anyway, so now I'm again back working on rotate Z, and I need to come back 1, and if I'm back 1 frame, that means here I'm going to slide middle mouse, slide back, and then delete this key, adjust the curves, because I want it straight. I still want it straight on frame 1, so I'm going to kind of force some of this. So it's straight on frame 1, which means it has to be straight on frame 24. Got to zero that key out. And it's got to be straight here, obviously, because that's my loop frame. And then maybe make that a little steeper, and let's see how it's working. Alright, that looks pretty decent. It took a minute to kind of clean up my keys, but that looks decent. Let's actually figure out what this errant key is here. Those are all unnecessary. I'm going to blow those away. And go back and play, and it looks good. Again, my 0 frame, right, there is still a frame in which it's totally straight, but even though it's totally straight for 1 frame at the beginning and 1 frame in the middle, and then at the end, of course, it still looks really good. And actually, one thing I have to do also is pull back this last keyframe because it's past my timeline. I can't actually play frame 49 in this setup, so there we go. And then the last thing that I can do is, again, I open up my curve editor and then increase this rate. I'm going to bring it even higher. Let's say 15 and 15 on either side. Steepen my curve a little bit. And that looks good. I'm actually going to make this, in class I made the last handle really steep. I'm going to make this handle really steep instead. I'm going to make this, I'm going to double it. And again, I gotta kind of mess with my curves to make it look good. Kind of frame it just to see what I'm working with more effectively. And by the way, some of you are thinking to yourself, like, oh, it's impossible to get these to line up perfectly. You don't have to get them to line up perfectly. You have to get them to line up in a way that is visually convincing, right? And that's not visually convincing. There is a little bit of a snap, so I've just got a little bit more work to do on this key. I think that this one is steeper than this one, so let's pull that a little bit. And and I think we're probably about good on there. So we're basically just going to do the same thing to the next one. So we've got our key, bring it to frame 48, set another key, and then frame 25, set another key, and then right, our last position is going to be this most bent position. So on this one, negative 20 and positive 20. Okay, so it has less arc than the previous one, but I don't like that. I'm actually just going to start going a little bit crazy here. Let's make it even higher than the previous. Oops, that is not how I wanted to do that. Oh, it's because I'm on this key, which is negative 40, and I'm trying to edit this key in this field. I need to edit it in this field because I'm not on the key. So my timeline is letting me edit the current time. The current time is here. But the curve editor lets you edit anytime. I could edit frame, 1 just as easily as I could edit frame 48. That's way cooler looking. I think that looks way better. Anyway, so let me get into just sort of isolate the curve that I'm working on. And let's make it look nice. Alright, now it's a little bit cartoony because the intensity makes the... Well, no, I guess it actually does work. I think the physics of this are not broken. I'm going to do one more thing in this that I did not do in class. And let me see what time it is real quick. Alright. So, the last thing I'm going to do is this looks nice. Right? This is all working reasonably well. I'm going to make it look a little bit better. And the way that I'm going to do that is like what I was talking about in class, which is overlap. Overlap is to change the timing of when things happen. So I'm actually going to make each subsequent controller event happen slightly after the previous one. I'm going to say 2 frames. So let's just take this controller, right, our second controller, not controller master, but controller 2. I'm going to take every single key, slide it forward 2 frames. And you're going to think to yourself, like, well, that just means you have blank keys at the beginning of your animation, which is true. But you already know how to solve that. You can go to frame 48, middle mouse drag back, set a key, and then make the curves pretty. Right, just point it right at the next key, and that ought to make a repeating animation. And its overlap is nice. It makes the animation look a little bit nicer. Now this next one, I have to make it happen 2 frames later, but it has to happen 2 frames later than something that is already happening 2 frames later. So this second controller, I am going to slide forward by 4 frames instead of by 2. So let's actually make sure that we've got all the keys selected, or all the curves selected, and then all the keys selected, and then shift move with the middle mouse to the right. That was 2, and there's 4. And again, we know the trick, middle mouse from frame 48 to frame 1, set a key, make the curve pretty, and we ought to be set. Now this one has a little bit of a different fall off. So remember, this one is actually coming in an arc down, so I'm not going to point it quite as straight as the previous one. Hopefully that will line up about right. And now it looks a little bit nicer, right? The action is happening down the chain slightly later on each of them. So even though I started out with a reasonably strong animation, that overlap, that delay of each subsequent action down the hierarchical chain of our structure made it just look a little bit sharper, a little bit nicer. So one last thing I'm going to do, just something that we talked about in class, is I'm going to mess with my orientation, right? So there's object orientation, and that means, and I'm not setting keys anymore. or at least I'm going to undo all of the changes that I make. This is just for illustrative purposes. So right now, up is relative to the object itself, because I am in object axis orientation. Right, forward is forward related to the object, up is up related to the object. Then let's go to world. Now, world axis orientation, up is always up, right is always right, forward is always forward. So that's world orientation. The axis is aligned to the world. And then the next one is parent. Parent is the one that I find most useful when dealing with rigging problems. But you'll find a lot of uses for a lot of these different axis orientations. So in this one, up is not relative to this object. Up is relative to its parent. So, and you'll actually see this is the one that actually is how your objects are defined. Parent orientation, or if there is no parent, world orientation. But parent orientation is the units in which your little text boxes here for your translation is defined, because when it's parented to an object, all of those numbers are only considered absolute in comparison to your parent's pivot, or to its parent's pivot. So that's what I'm modifying right now, right? Which is different than object. Object initially seems like that's what it should be, but it can't be that, and the reason we know it can't be that is because if I rotate this, my axis orientation has changed, right? Which, I mean, is kind of wrong, right? You don't measure the orientation of a thing. You don't measure its rotations before you decide where it's positioned. It's positioned as absolute in comparison to its parent object, or if it has no parent object, its parent object is considered the world. So it's just the origin. That's 0 point on our grid down here. So we went over that in class a little bit, but they're super useful to kind of deal with at some points. A lot of them we won't talk about right now, but we will later, and they are super helpful and super useful tools to kind of use and figure out what's best when you understand them. But for now, those three are the big ones: parent, object, and world orientation for your axis. And it happens on all of your objects. You've got them on move, rotate, and scale. Those ones: object, world, and parent. So anyway, that's going to be the end of this video. I'm just going to close my tool settings real quick, and I'll play this, zoom out a little bit, play this a little bit more, just so you can kind of see that nice overlap happening. I think it looks really nice. But we're going to call that the end of this video. We're shooting right about 30 minutes, and hopefully that's helped you guys figure out some of the tricks to get that curve editor working really well. Remember the difference between your middle mouse button and your right click when making changes, right? You don't actually have to be near the thing to move it when you're using your middle mouse button. So middle mouse I find is sort of the magic key a lot of times in Maya. I wind up using that quite a bit, and it's super helpful. But let's call it there, and we'll see all your guys' pendulum tests in class, and they will hopefully look super cool, and we are done.